All right, welcome to the Mighty Things podcast, episode 1 with myself, Micah, and David. Yeah, we're really excited to talk about this book that you just finished reading about Teddy Roosevelt. And so at Mighty Things, our mission is to get people outside, kind of exploring the real world, achieving things, being resourceful, building resilience. And so today we're talking about someone who I think did exemplify that in their life, which is Theodore Roosevelt. That's exactly right. So as you mentioned, we're going to be covering this book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. And it's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's a great book. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But it covers from the beginning of Theodore's life, so his birth through his presidency, the beginning of his presidency. So he still did a lot more in life after that, but that's the section we're going to focus on today. But in case people don't have any idea who Roosevelt is, I think, David, you got a few points you wanted to share there. Yeah, so a lot of people have heard of Roosevelt, and I think if you have heard of him, you probably think about he was president, U.S. president in the early 1901. He took office. He's known as being a reformer, busting up monopolies, a conservation hero, establishing national parks, and really a larger-than-life personality, a rough rider, avid outdoorsman, a forceful communicator. So those are kind of some of the things that come to mind when you think of Roosevelt. Absolutely. And so as David mentioned, we're going to be covering probably a number of different historic figures who accomplished various things, mighty things, good role models. And part of the reason we chose Roosevelt is our brand name, Mighty Things, actually came from him. So I'm going to read a quote from one of his famous speeches, and just to set the scene, give the context, at this point in his life, he's a governor of New York. He's a war hero. He's just come back, and he's giving this speech, and it becomes known as the Strenuous Life. And here's just one excerpt from it. So far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. And I think this is a quote that it's not just nice sounding words. I think this truly embodies Theodore's life. And, we don't necessarily align with all of his political views. We're not advocating for that. That's not the point. Right. But I think he was a man of character and he accomplished a lot. And so that's kind of why we're starting with him. Yeah, absolutely. So very inspiring. And so we want to, I guess, start by talking about his early life, kind of some cool stories up to his presidency taken from this book that we read, which is the range it covers. And then after that, we'll just kind of talk about, what is relevant or applicable, what you can be inspired about practically by Roosevelt. So yeah, let's jump into it. All right, let's do it. Yeah. So Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858. So think context just before the Civil War, a few years before. That's kind of all taking place in the background. You have Abraham Lincoln is debating Stephen Douglas of this year. And he's born in New York City to Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and his mother, Martha. And it was kind of interesting that his parents seemed to be polar opposites in a lot of ways. Explain what you mean by that. Absolutely. Yeah. So his dad is from New York City, and it's a family of multimillionaire business people, very successful. His mother is from the South, I think from Georgia, but a previous plantation owner. And again, this is in the context of the Civil War. You have those two cultures coming together. And then personality-wise, his dad, very similar to him, was very larger than life, extremely gregarious, outgoing, successful. And his mother was super quiet, almost passive. So you kind of had that personality range there, which, it can be healthy in a way, I guess, because you get, multiple perspectives, but just an interesting perspective on his life. And this was, I guess, I don't know if well-heeled is the right word, but this was more of a upper cut family in New York. I just wanted to mention, too, one of the things that struck me about is the time was an interesting time in history with all the stuff going on. So you have, like you mentioned, we're towards the end of the Civil War. And we have all this kind of industrialization going on. We have these massive companies like Transcontinental Railways, which relates to the monopoly busting that he does later. It's just an interesting time in history. That's right. And, even though they were wealthy, I think it's easy to say okay, he had life easy. He, just kind of rode on that, had a silver spoon, or however you want to say it. But that's actually not true, because he was very, very sick as a child. So from the time he's born all the way through his young adult life, even beyond, he suffered severely from asthma, and they did not really have treatment. So some of his earliest memories are his dad trying to help him breathe as a child. And so his dad would take him, strap him in a carriage, and just drive as fast as he could around New York, trying to force wind into his lungs. And He has memories of just being up at night, not being able to breathe. And you can just imagine how terrible that is for both the parents and him as a child. Yeah, and that is not what you would think of when you think of Roosevelt as like a sickly kid, but that is, yeah, I remember reading it, and that is how he started out. So another interesting thing about his childhood is just kind of his family standards. His dad was likely a devout Christian. He was involved in a lot of charity and giving, and he would help like orphans around New York, sending them to ranches, and just very generous. But he was also, as we mentioned, a very successful businessman. And so they had this kind of exposure to both sides of society, which was very polarized at the time. And so you had the very wealthy as well as the very poor side. And his dad did apply those standards to the family. So, he definitely instructed his kids in morality. And throughout his life, Theodore really had a strong sense of morality. And I think it probably came from that upbringing. Yeah, definitely more of a principled family that kind of had standards, and even being a business person, still being a principled person. So as he's getting older, age 3 through age 7, you have the Civil War take place. So the interesting thing there is, again, his family is split right down the middle. His mother's side, she actually had brothers fighting for the Confederacy, and his dad was very pro-Lincoln, pro-Union. So that had to be a fun time in the family. And part of the way they worked that out is the dad decided not to fight in the Civil War. He hired somebody to fight for him, which is, again, going back to the wealthy thing. That's something that wealthy people would do. But that's actually something that Theodore really did not like about, his dad. It definitely left a mark, and he remembered. I don't know if it was sort of like his dad I don't know if he thought he was cowardly, not facing up. And it seemed like he really admired his dad, but maybe that was the one thing that he felt like was a black mark on his dad's record. That's right. It seems like he truly like revered his dad, except for that one thing. And I think this plays into his life later. We'll get to it, where he decides to fight when a war comes and goes out of his way to find that. Little bit of foreshadowing there. So yeah, the other thing that's going on during this time, he's learning to read, and he becomes a super avid reader from an early age. Some of the first books he reads are about natural history, and he becomes obsessed with animals. And there's a lot of really funny stories as he starts to collect specimens and build his personal museum at his house. I don't know how many people had books at the time. I'm not a historian, so I don't know how common it was, but I would imagine they had access to a larger library of things. And so if you wanted to read, the family probably had access to that in a way that less fortunate families would. So yeah, I think the other thing is, because he was sick all the time, he a lot of times was stuck at home for weeks at a time. And there was one particular chair he just would sit in and read voraciously. And so he went through apparently every book in his family library. And as we go through his life and he starts to have tutors, there's a lot of comments around, well, he actually knew more than his tutors on a lot of subjects, and randomly, probably because of the books he had access to. So not necessarily across the board, but when it came to natural history, especially, it just had abnormal knowledge, and he was interested in science in that way from a very early age. So there's funny stories about him collecting like toads and mice, and they would be in his hat, and he'd take his hat off to, like tip his hat or whatever, and the frogs would fall out. Honestly, he sounds a little bit like a nerd as a kid. And in that time period, in that context. What I remember too is he he didn't he drive his nanny crazy, I think, just with the things that he would bring into the house and collect, and the things that he was working on. He I think he had like a collection of the things that when he went outdoors, and like specimens and that sort of thing, and he made his own like museum, is what he called it. Right. So the nannies had to deal with all that. And apparently he got into taxidermy at a young age, which is where you're preserving. As one does. Preserving dead animals. Yeah. So he always smelled like arsenic, which I guess a chemical they used. Yeah. Probably before they knew it was bad for you. I'm just kidding. They knew it was poisonous, but yeah, I'm sure. So yeah, let's move on then and talk a bit more about his teenage years. So you kind of have that context of a super bright child who's reading a lot, but is very sick all the time. Yeah. But they are very privileged. So as he gets older, his family's taking year-long trips to Europe, going down the Nile, visiting Europe. He's tutored by a German family for a summer. One of the interesting stories from this time period is another, going along with the health theme. He is gifted a rifle by his father, or a shotgun or something like that. And he's out trying to collect his natural history specimens, or he's shooting birds. And he finds that his friends can shoot things that he can't even see. And so he's like, okay, this isn't good. He tells his dad, and they go get glasses. And it turns out he's so myopic, it's to the point of he's not blind, but he's very, very
Mhm.
close. And this is a theme throughout the rest of his life. You always see him with the glasses in the pictures. But when he'd go on adventures, he would actually sew glasses into his hats so that he would have them because he was so reliant on them. I don't know, it just kind of is like, again, contrasting the going out and exploring. You have the guy who has to like carry glasses with him the whole time because he's so blind. One other story I wanted to call out here that we kind of passed over was, he had all these health issues throughout his childhood. At one point, his dad takes him aside, and I think he was a young teenager, maybe a little bit younger. And his dad tells him, you've got the mind, you're really smart, you're bright, but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go far in life. So he charged him, basically, make your body.
Mhm.
And there was a witness there who remembered it and was like, yeah, he agreed to do it. And then he actually went out and did it, not just for a season, kind of like our New Year's resolutions, but really starting at that point for the rest of his life. He was extremely active in exercising and pushing himself. And so even though he was young there and he worked really hard, honestly, just to keep up with where everybody else was, he did work hard and again, this comes back to physically, he was working hard, mentally, he was working hard, always reading, always exercising. And I think that's a theme throughout his life, but it started at a very young age, just that self-discipline. So eventually they come back from one of their European trips and he's getting ready to go to Harvard. And, at this point he's 15, 16, but there's really tough entrance exams. And his education's a bit spotty because they've been traveling a lot, again, because of his health largely. So he's very deep in certain areas, but there's other areas where he's just kind of behind, which is kind of an interesting theme, on the way we approach education is just so structured these days. And it's like you learn everything in each grade, but he had to come back and he really had to study hard for a couple of years and really, really put his nose to the books and caught up in order to make it into Harvard. I think probably traveling, they talk about traveling being a broadening experience. And it's expensive to travel now. I'm sure it was way more expensive then, but just being able to go abroad internationally, kind of expanding your horizons, I think that was probably a important thing for him to see that. And he like later in his life, he seems like he's pretty astute when it comes to like not international policy to an extent, but yeah, dealing with other nations and kind of even just exploring. Like he goes to other countries to explore. And so you can see like him going out and kind of building that experience here as a kid before he takes off. So I think that comes back to like he had a really well-rounded education instead of being focused. But it was like all that life experience and the different languages and cultures. And yeah, that definitely shows up throughout his life. Yeah. Really quick, some things that are going on in the world at the time. The telephone was discovered around this time when he's going into Harvard. A little foreshadowing for some upcoming stories. Joseph Glidden patents barbed wire, which is useful for cattle ranching. And then a little earlier, the Colt 45 Peacemaker was introduced. So some really iconic things. Important, yeah. Yeah. All right, so he enters college, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about his college years. This is his first time away from the family, and he's kind of building out his own life. He starts with obviously the general ed of college, but he's very focused on science. So even while he's taking college classes, he's still collecting samples. He actually writes a pamphlet on birds that he's discovered, which was very well reviewed by biologists at the time. Yeah, entering Harvard and writing a book at the same time as one does. I think some interesting observations from classmates at the time, because you start to get the historical record where people are, hey, I remember that guy from school, and they write their memories. It's interesting because his personality was, again, very gregarious, very outgoing. It says basically he was fascinating to talk to because he had just such a wide range of things to talk about. But he was kind of like, he lacked self-awareness in a way. So he would talk a lot. Again, kind of, he's often described as being childlike in a way, and not in like a demeaning he was, stupid or anything like that, but almost like this curiosity, this like unbounded energy at times, in the way he would talk would just be like all out there, just like putting it all out there. So very, very interesting personality. Yeah, I think eccentric is a word definitely comes to mind when you read about him. Very gifted, but eccentric. But somebody who was an encyclopedia and someone who would have been uh, probably very fascinating to talk to. Now, I think there are some stories about him talking too much and boring people, so it could go the other direction. But just knowing a lot of things and just having a lot of things to say about a lot of subjects. Um, because he was so widely, I guess, or mentally quick or well read, I don't know. It's just when you read about him, it's like he's on a different plane. There's so much information he knows and is able to synthesize on so many different subjects. Right. He was AI right before AI existed. Basically, it's like able to talk about so many different things and kind of apply them in unique ways that maybe people aren't able to see the patterns. He was able to see a lot of things just with his vast knowledge. So, still in the midst of his college career here, he gets some news that his dad is not doing so well. And then it's like, okay, his dad is doing better health wise. And then he gets a note basically, hey, you got to come see us. Something's really bad. And so he goes. And while he's on the train trying to make it back to New York where his family was, his dad actually passes away. And it turns out it was stomach cancer. It was not a pretty end. Sounds extremely painful. And, his dad was such a central character in his early life. It was absolutely devastating for him. So one of the things that happened, when his dad passed away is he kind of had to make a decision on, okay, what's he going to do in life? His dad was kind of the financier, he had all the money.
Yeah.
And so there were some practical decisions he had to make. And I think this is probably part of the reason he ended up not going into science. And this is about the time where he made that decision. So instead of going into science, natural history as a career, he was also like looking at that and it's like, okay, it would have required extra education, which he was not super thrilled with. And at the time, he's like, okay, maybe politics. And he starts exploring that and getting more involved. And that's actually kind of becomes a theme throughout his life. But politics is the direction he actually ends up picking ultimately. Some other things happening during this time. The light bulb was invented and the first commercial telephone exchange opened. So just some facts here. So you can just imagine, you're in the kind of the old world there going to school, and then it's like the light bulb, kind of like AI for us today. I think it's like all these things happening, but they were so fundamental to changing the world around the turn of the century there. So a few other things during school, and then we're going to move on. He begins writing his first major book, and he wrote many, many books throughout his life, but it's called The Naval War of 1812. And he starts writing that in school. He doesn't finish it until later, but it actually becomes a authoritative look at what happened during 1812 from the Navy. And both the British and U.S. Began using it as a resource. The U.S. Navy actually uses it once he finishes it. So again, you can kind of just see the quality and depth of his work there. Yeah. Also, the Navy was something he was always really interested in, and that comes back later.
Do you know why he was interested in it? Because I remember that too, where he writes a book about the Navy. He's involved in the Navy later, which we're talking about coming up here. Why the Navy?
Yeah, I kind of wonder if it kind of touches on his somewhat imperialist expansionist views, and there's no getting around it. He thought the United States was exceptional, and he thought that it should spread as far as it could, basically. We're not going to comment on that other than that is the reality of it. And I think the Navy is how he saw that happening. It was the way that we could project power around the world.
You do think of the British Empire in a sense coming out of that as well, kind of a similar kind of conquest spirit, having a powerful navy. So there's some similarities there, I think, in terms of influence. I do remember that he kind of, because he knew so many things, he trained himself a lot about like the way ships work and describing the rigging and all the things that were on the ships of the day. He was kind of made himself sort of an amateur expert on the subject.
So as he's finishing up school, he meets Alice Hathaway Lee, falls deeply in love and courts her for a couple of years. This is kind of after his dad passes away too. But they ultimately end up getting married basically right after his graduation. And so we're kind of moving on to the next phase of his life here. He's now married, he's graduated, moves back to New York, and is kind of looking for what he's going to do in life.
Yeah, sounds good. So we're going to start talking about kind of his married life here and how he gets into politics. And then after that, we'll get on to the Cowboy era. So that's coming up next.
Yes, very exciting.
Yes.
So we can probably summarize this part a little bit here. So as I mentioned, they get married, they do a quick honeymoon in Europe, and he actually climbs the Matterhorn at the time, which was not done very often. I think the first time it was climbed was 1860 something. And so this is like 20 years later. It was a significant climb. So again, he's just always out there pushing himself. He publishes his book that we were talking about, The War of 1812, and he's also elected to the New York State Assembly as the youngest congressman there. And that kind of becomes his job there for the next couple of years of his life.
I remember the New York era was definitely foundational to his presidency later. Like he gets into politics, he kind of figures out how like the political machine works. And then he also, I think, gets a front row seat to some of the corruption during the time. I think there was a lot of corruption in New York at the time.
Absolutely. And so this becomes a theme throughout the rest of his life, is kind of fighting corruption, one of the things he's known for. So you can imagine he's elected as this freshman state rep, and he goes there, and basically the way it worked back then is you had these political bosses who would be like, "Hey, I'll help
Yeah.
you get elected. You can get elected, no problem, as long as you put my friends in positions of power, or as long as you do XYZ." And so what this created was certain power brokers who had
Hmm.
huge control over legislation that was passed, all these things. And so he's constantly fighting against this. But there's outright bribery going on. There's like these reps will actually write bills in order to get bribes not to pass them. So they would write bills
Yeah.
against businesses, and then the businesses would bribe them not to pass. So he's elected to the assembly, and then he actually becomes the speaker of the assembly. And he's pushing for civil service reform, which is basically anti-corruption. And he's working closely with the governor, who actually is a Democrat. Throughout his life, he seems to have these high points and low points.
Yeah.
And at this point, he's at highest of the high. Again, he's super young. He's like a political rocket ship. He's starting to get press around the country, not just in New York.
Yeah.
And then his wife is pregnant. She's about to have this daughter, and he gets the news that things are not going well. So he leaves wherever he is for his job there, and he goes back to New York to be with her. And he finds out his mother is also sick. And unfortunately, they both end up dying on the same day. So his daughter is born, his wife dies, his mother dies, and it's Valentine's Day. And he is absolutely wiped out and devastated. He writes in his journal, "The light has gone out of my life." So you can just imagine, again, after losing his father, he's now lost his wife and his mother, and the world is just kind of crumbling around him.
Yeah, that's a lot to go through. So definitely it was extremely devastating for him. And so this is the point where he leaves for the Dakotas territory um, to set up a ranch. So we're kind of transitioning into this next era here,
That's right.
just as almost a coping mechanism. I can't remember why he picked the Dakotas. Was it someone he knew? I think there was some connection.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So before his wife died, he had gone out there on a hunting trip. And just to set
Okay.
the scene here, this is around 1885, 1884, 1885. These are not states, they are territories.
Mhm.
There are no lawmen around. This is
Yeah.
truly the Wild West. So you show up in these cow towns with a
Yeah.
train, and you've got cowboys running around. Truly the Wild West. So he went out there buffalo hunting and just fell in love with the wildness of it and the openness. And then he ends up purchasing some cattle during that time, and then that's, like, right before his wife dies, and then his wife dies, and I think at that point, it's like, he just kind of he needs a reset, and he's like,
Yeah.
"Okay, I'm leaving New York." I doubt he had planned that originally, but
Yeah.
with his life crumbling, he's like, "I'm going to the Dakotas, and I'm gonna be a cowboy."
Yeah. I guess you could say this was the very last chance to be a cowboy, quote unquote. There's obviously a lot of mythology around that, but there was still, open land. It was very rugged and wild, as you say. It was kind of before it had been sort of fully tamed. And so, yeah, he took the train out to, Medora? I'm trying to remember the name of the city.
Yeah, it's near there in the Dakotas. I think it
Yeah.
was Little Missouri is where he started.
Okay.
And so he goes out there, and he ends up buying some land, building his ranch house, buying a bunch
Yeah.
of cows. And we're not talking small investments here. He takes
Yeah.
over the next few years, he takes roughly half of his fortune and puts it into cows. And he becomes a rancher, and he is out there with the cowboys every
Mhm.
day, chopping down trees. A lot of really crazy stories that go on during this time.
Well, first of all, this is probably my favorite part of the book. Like, I mean, it's hard for it not to be. It's just really colorful, and it's kind of a left turn in a little bit. It's like, what? What's he doing?
Yeah.
Like, he's out, and it's this guy who's, well heeled from New York, assemblyman. He's going to do this. The other thing that stood out to me is, he's with these cowboys, really rough era, and they would not have respected someone who was sort of like soft. They'd probably look at him as soft. But it did mention, I remember that he won their respect because he was just tough. He did what they did, and he was able to kind of hold his own. And so he did earn their respect. And so, I mean, I don't know about specifically from this period, but you do think of some of the photos of him with all the rough riders with him. And, he's more of the gentleman, but he was able to actually, hold his own with them. So they respected him for it.
That's right. So he goes out there, he's got his glasses, and at the time, Westerners thought that people with glasses like were sneaky or something. Like it was just a thing. So they called him Four Eyes and all this. And like you said, he had to demonstrate, he had to earn that trust, and he ultimately did. And we'll talk a few of the stories just because they're so crazy. But one of them that stood out to me is like, he's out there, it's freezing cold, so he goes into this saloon to warm up. And there's a drunk cowboy in there shooting the place up. You can just imagine taking shots at the clock and all that kind of stuff. And this drunk cowboy starts harassing Teddy. So Teddy ends up knocking him out, which in college he was a boxer. I forgot to mention that. But yeah, so he fights this guy, knocks him out. And the dude had guns. This was not just a fist fight here. But that's just one of the examples of kind of the Wild West there. I think another one had to do with a boat chase.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah, the boat chase was probably one of my favorite stories. So, he's at his ranch and somebody comes, they steal his boat. And so he has some other ranch hands with him, but he's like, we're going to chase them down and take this person to justice. So they get in their, I guess, other canoes and they're chasing this person down. And there's actually, I think, a story about him, they're on the chase, in the wilderness, and I think they're like camping overnight or something, or I can't remember exactly. I think it may have been raining or something, but he's reading a book like in his tent or something while they're like chasing this criminal across open country. So, he's reading and still reading and following his intellectual pursuits, but they catch the thief. And then I think, what was it? He forces the thief, like they catch him and make him march across like open Badlands country to the closest town with the sheriff, which I think is, I don't know if it's 50 miles. It's a long way.
It was something like that. And he basically took these guys at gunpoint by himself and marched them. Yeah, because his ranch hands who were with him had to stay with the boat that they saved. So he by himself takes these guys across, like 50 miles or whatever. Not sleeping at night because he can't, and he gets them to where the sheriff is. And I think this is one of those things where he wins credibility with those Westerners, and it became kind of a legend around there. Not just in the East where it did, but like out West, they were like, okay, this guy's legit.
Yeah, that was a really cool story.
So he's out there for a couple of years, and eventually, he's making occasional trips back to New York to visit his family. His daughter is there, and he runs into essentially an old girlfriend. And they get engaged, and he decides, okay, it's time to kind of move on from the cowboy stuff. So he ends up moving back to New York, and this is kind of the next section of his life that we'll get to. But before we do that winter, there was an absolute devastating storm that went through the Dakotas, and it was one of the worst recorded. They had many, 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 many feet of snow. A lot of the cattle froze to death. Apparently, once it thawed out, there were cows in trees because the snowpack was so deep, and the cows were up there, and then, they died and they were stuck in the trees. And it absolutely wiped out his ranch and many of the other ranches. And as I mentioned, half of his fortune was in cattle, and this was absolutely devastating for him.
Yeah, it was unprecedented devastation at the time. And Roosevelt wasn't very successful from a financial perspective. I think that's something else I noticed from reading it. Like he had to borrow money at various times, and then he had some like devastating business losses. So I think like a high level of business acumen, you probably wouldn't hold him to high marks for that. In this case, obviously he couldn't have helped it. But yeah, huge devastation. So then I guess we're kind of transitioning into talking a little bit more now about his family life and kind of his sort of part two of his politics now that he's heading back to civilization from being a cowboy.
You can imagine him coming back to New York. Apparently his wife has a bit more money sense than he does, so she helps him figure out how they're going to buckle down. But part of making ends meet in the giant houses that they have and have inherited, he becomes an author, or rather he has been an author. He's been writing actually all throughout this. He's been writing books. But that becomes more of a focus for him. So he writes a book called The Winning of the West, and eventually writes multiple books in that series, which was pretty successful for him. But again, you just have this constant trade-off between physical activity and rigor and grit, I think, is what comes out of his West adventures, with deep intellectual pursuits, where he's writing books that are maybe not the best in the world, but they are well read, well known, accepted by critics at the time.
Yeah, he definitely, he wrote those, and you can see his interest in obviously history, but Western history. So the rugged, kind of wild winning of the West, kind of the title says it all. Then he also, at this time, founds the Boone and Crockett Club, which is another thing that is well known for. I don't know if it's like a gentleman's outdoor club where you hunt and I get together and talk about outdoor things. I think that's what the club was.
Yeah, and it was all about conservation. So
Yeah.
from his time in the West, he realized that there was overhunting in many cases and just a general recklessness around like the buffalo and various things. So he founds this club as a conservation club for hunters, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
This is another theme throughout his presidency is like national parks and conservation. What was really interesting to me is like whenever we hear that sort of thing, we think like, oh, this is environmentalism. These people,
Right.
they don't like humans. They just want nature to go its way and like take humans out of it. But for him, I think there was a lot more balance and nuance in it where he was a hunter, but he wanted to preserve the land so that there would be a future for his kids and, for future generations. And that's a big impetus for the parks and this specific club that he founded.
Right. Yeah. I think you see that hunters, even today, can be actually conservation minded because they want their natural resources to be available for hunting. So being concerned about preserving it and stewarding the resources. So you definitely see that coming through here, which is kind of foreshadowing his role later he's well known for being a conservationist or a big movement and character in that movement.
Right. So, he's back, he's writing books, and he goes out and he campaigns for Benjamin Harrison to become president. And luckily for him, Benjamin wins the presidency. And basically, the way it worked back then is if you had an influence in the campaign, you would then be appointed to a job. That still happens to today, but like it was much more a thing back then. It kind of went back to most civil service jobs, including your random post office jobs, like all the way down the list. Whoever won elections got to give those jobs away.
I think it was called the spoils system. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And so whoever won got the spoils. And
That doesn't happen today.
yeah, right. I think we have other problems today, but benefited him in this case. He's appointed to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. And this kind of coming back to the civil service thing, at the time, this is anti-corruption because you had all those jobs handed out. And what would happen is you got those political bosses who controlled the jobs and a lot of bribery going on. Where like, hey, you give me this job, I'll give you this bribe. So he's part of the Civil Service Commission, and most people in that role before had just kind of taken a passive, like they'd take their paycheck, maybe check in with the civil service a little bit, but that's not really his style. He took his job very seriously.
Yeah, he was known for being principled. I think in his civil service work in New York, he kind of got involved with the police force reform, and I think he like pushed them to be more military like, less taking bribes and like more disciplined and looking out for the community. I think he viewed sort of military as kind of a role model for, discipline and you're following command and you're not self-interested. So those are some things that came through in this, in his work and kind of reforming and rooting out corruption.
That's right. That's right. So after the civil service stint there, I think he was there for 6 years. That's when he moved on and became police commissioner in New York. And that's exactly right. There was, again, tons of corruption in the New York Police Department where certain leaders in the police force would basically control certain districts. And so, again, they would get bribes from businesses or whatever to either enforce or not enforce the law. Lots of corruption. And that's what he came in and, again, was fighting for there. And he had very varied success throughout these different roles in politics. I think he was always a force of nature. And throughout this time, he started to generate like national headlines because he was just so vocal and so interesting. And people recognized that what he was doing was good. But he definitely hit a wall in many cases where, it's hard to beat the system. It's like you've got thousands of people who get jobs through this corruption and, he's fighting that. And so he definitely took some punches because of that.
One of the, famous stories I remember about him during this time is, I think they said he went on like midnight patrols to see what was going on. So he would kind of, go around and kind of be on the street. And that was, I guess, one of his ways of figuring out if people were doing their job.
That's exactly, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. So he's got a desk job, essentially. He's the police commissioner, which means he kind of just, the police report to him and he makes sure they are doing what they're supposed to. But that's right. So he's out there on the beat at night, overnight, many, many nights. This is not a one-off thing. He'll go out and he'll make sure that the cops who are supposed to be on beat, meaning walking a certain neighborhood, are out there. And there's many stories of him like finding these guys in saloons or even worse. And like, he sets them straight for sure.
He was kind of a freight train when you like of activity, that is a theme you see even like in his presidency, is just going into a situation and being just like a total steamroller is probably not the right word, but just making things happen at a
Right.
rapid pace. And that was like energy combined with intellectual rigor and even physical rigor. He could just get stuff done really quickly and would really, really push to make things, make things happen.
Yeah, I think he had a photographic memory,
Yeah.
and so he would be able to read books overnight and then be able to quote passages from them. It
Yeah.
mentions that. But in the context of this kind of work, he would write thousands of letters. Like, I think in his life, over 100,000 letters are still in existence from him.
Yeah.
And so you can just imagine him just like coming into a role where people typically don't do much, and he's just like turning the ship around. And he gets a lot of friends from doing this, a lot of national press, but
Mhm.
also a lot of enemies. And that's kind of, again, that tug of war that's going on. A couple other things that's happening. So all throughout this time, he's having children with his second wife here. So he's got Alice, his original baby, and then they have Kermit and Ethel and Archibald. This is the late 1880s,
Mhm.
1890s. He's in his 30s, and he's taking on the civil service and then the police board as well. Eventually, he lands a job as assistant secretary of the Navy. So this is now 1897, so almost the turn of the century. He's now 39 years old, so he's getting up there a bit. And he's appointed to this role. And again, this is going back to the Navy. A big part of the reason for this is because he was viewed as an authoritative expert on naval affairs. If
Mhm.
you remember that book, that first book he wrote, The Naval War of 1812, that kind of was influential
Right.
in this appointment here. But again, very, very similar stories where he comes in and he's the assistant secretary. He's, under the leader who actually ran the Navy, but that guy was pretty passive, and it
Yeah.
sounds like he came in and kind of ran things from the back seat.
Yeah, yeah, that was the impression I got, dispatching things wildly left and right to different places and just kind of like, I don't know, it's like an orchestra conductor almost. Like he was just orchestrating and pushing so many things at the same time. Yeah, he was a proponent, I think, for fortifying the Navy was one of the things that I remember reading, kind of assessing where our Navy was at. And he viewed the Navy as being like a really key aspect to, I mean, imperialism. I mean, he was imperialistic, but having a strong Navy was really important. And so that I don't know. Are we covering the famous quote that he has, which is "Speak softly and carry a big stick"?
That's right. So his view was basically, if you want peace, you need to be prepared for war. If that sounds familiar, I think actually a lot of rhetoric in the current administration echoes things that Theodore Roosevelt said. So whether that's accidental or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, his quote there: "Speak softly, but carry a big stick," and that is very much how he ran the Navy. Legislation is passed, and they begin building up the Navy. They begin modernizing it. He is very influential in that happening. And it turns out to be a good thing because we actually end up in a conflict with Spain, which is kind of the
Mhm.
next portion here. So what's going on is, you remember all the colonies from the European powers, and Spain is still holding on to Cuba, various other territories in the Western Hemisphere. And at this time, Cuba is in rebellion against Spain, and the United States is kind of taking the Cuban side. Spain is, pretty brutal in their repression of the Cubans. And so the US public is kind of very much on the Cuban side. And at one point, we send a warship down there to Havana Harbor, and it's
Mhm.
called the USS Maine. And it's just there kind of observing, not really active, but it ends up exploding. And this is a huge turning point where it was like, okay, we're observing this conflict between Spain and Cuba. Okay, now our warship blows up. And the press at this time, the yellow journalists go
Yeah.
absolutely nuts. They're demanding war, and an investigation takes place that is questionable at best, but they basically
Mhm.
blame the Spanish, for blowing up our ship, and that leads to a whole bunch of the following activities that we're going to cover here.
Yeah, this was I guess going back to his dad not being part of the previous war, it seemed like he was looking, would you say he was like looking for a conflict to get involved in?
Yeah, I think when war came, he did not want to be on the sidelines, is
Yeah,
maybe how I'd put it. I don't think he necessarily wanted war for war's sake.
sure.
I think he believed that Spain should not be in the Western Hemisphere, which is very much the Monroe Doctrine, which he was a proponent of. And so I think this was an opportunity, and he was more than glad to take it. So the interesting thing is, so he's assistant secretary of the Navy. He has prepared the Navy throughout the past several years. There's a big naval battle that takes place largely because he's positioned it. And the U.S. absolutely dominates and wins that battle, wipes out the Spanish fleet that is fighting near the Philippines, which is part of the reason the U.S. ends up with the Philippines. So this is all going on. And he's like, okay, I can't have a desk job through all of this. And he resigns from his position as a Navy secretary.
Yeah, so he resigns, and he organizes the Rough Riders. Like, that's the other legendary thing people know about him. There's the photos of him with the Rough Riders standing there in the middle, it looking extremely, all of them looking really tough dudes.
So
Yeah.
he raises these volunteers who actually came from all over, but a lot of them were his Western friends. So you think all these cowboys. They also had a number of folks from like Ivy League schools. So it was a mixed bunch.
Yeah.
The name actually was kind of picked by the media because of his history as a cowboy. But even there, so he's offered this commission as a colonel, and he turns it down because he thinks that that's going to get him doing paperwork, and he's like, I'm not quite ready for that. I want to be on the front lines. And so he's actually, again, going back to, he always regretted that his dad didn't fight, for better or worse. That's just kind of where he was at. And so he signs up, and not only does he sign up, he positions himself to be on the front lines of this conflict.
He goes to Cuba with the Rough Riders, a legendary bunch in history. And I want to, I guess, make a quick note about Roosevelt's use of the media. He's known for being able to use publicity effectively to get attention. And so I think there was a little bit of publicity here. There's photos of it, and he's able to kind of get attention. I don't know if that was like a conscious strategy at the time, but definitely did get a lot of attention for this. But then, they charge, I guess, up Kettle Hill, San Juan Heights. They have a charge. The U.S. is victorious in the conflict. And I think the stories are, he was extremely brave, I guess, in combat, not extremely fearless, ready to just dive in. And then, of course, he has a lot of really tough people with him.
Again, I'd always kind of viewed him as a character. Like, he got the hat, he rode around, got the applause for that, or the applause. But this is for real. Like, this was a real conflict. And reading this story, they're marching through the jungle, which none of them were used to, extreme heat. And there is conflict with the Spanish troops who basically we're trying to hold on to these territories that we were taking in Cuba. And so there's a number of conflicts that he's engaged with there. Several of his friends die. But to your point, there were reporters embedded with the troops, and he made a point of being friends with the reporters. So yeah. I think, again, this is for real. He was actually fighting, his charge up San Juan Hill. He was in the lead there.
Exactly.
So I think he was very much a real soldier, very much put it all on the line. But it definitely benefits him. And he kind of, again, like you said, knew how to use that image.
Yeah, definitely. That was a huge boost. He returns as a war hero, and then he's elected governor of New York. So it was, this is definitely a high point for him.
That's right. So he comes back, he's that war hero, he gets elected governor. And if you remember that quote I read at the very beginning, this is that time period where he's giving his speech on the strenuous life. And so now with this context of like, okay, he's 41 years old. He's one of the younger governors. He's had this incredible life. He's been in war. He's been a cowboy. He's been a civil servant, all these different things. And he comes in and he is now carrying on with his anti-corruption campaign as governor. So he's able to pass some political reforms. They get quite a few things done. And he's actually causing so much trouble as governor that the political bosses of the time were like, okay, we've got to get rid of this guy. We don't want him to run for re-election as governor because he's definitely going to win. And so they're like, okay, let's make him vice president, because the vice president that doesn't do any power.
Yeah, just make
right.
Vice president.
And so that's kind of how then he goes through this election cycle as, nominated as vice president, and they end up winning.
Yeah, so they made him vice president, and that's not what ended up panning out, right?
So the president is McKinley, and unfortunately McKinley is shot by an anarchist, and this is pretty soon after the election. And so lo and behold, Teddy Roosevelt, they were trying to get rid of him, trying to sideline him, is now president of the United States. He, at age 42, he was at the time the youngest president in U.S. history. That may actually still be the case. How old was JFK? In any event, he was one of the youngest presidents in U.S. history. And this is only the beginning. So this is the end of the book that we read, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. There's actually 2 other books by the same author. that cover the rest of his life. So he had a term that he inherited as president. He then went on to win his own term as president. So I think it was 7 years total. And then after that, he ends up going on many crazy adventures that we'll have to cover later. He goes on a trip to Africa. He goes on a discovery journey to the Amazon and actually discovers a river. Crazy, crazy story. So again, you imagine this guy, he becomes president. He's at the top of the game. But even after that, he's going on and making scientific discoveries and all of that. But we're not going to get into that.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for future
That's
episodes.
for part 2 and part 3, right?
Right.
Yeah, this was just volume 1.
Maybe we can just chat a little bit about this life and this story. And what does it mean for us? Maybe what did you find inspirational about it? I can cover the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously we'd be quick to say like this is not your average Joe, like someone who is very unusual person. But a lot of things that could be inspired by. I think what I was struck by was, I mean, not Renaissance man. I mean, just the like combination of things that he did. He was very physically rigorous and he was very intellectually rigorous, and political career, naturalist, cowboy, war hero. Like the list keeps going on and on. And so, yeah, just the model of being able to kind of try so many different things and new challenges. I think obviously we aren't Roosevelt, but people kind of limit themselves sometimes and say like, I can only do this or I can only do that. But you see that combination of things and it's like, maybe I could do a few more things than I thought, right? Yeah.
That is, I think, what makes him so interesting is like, you think of an all-American football player and it's like, they're incredibly physical. And you're probably like, okay, they may not be that bright. That's a stereotype, obviously. That's probably not always true. But it's like, okay, so he builds himself into being physically very strong from a terrible beginning, like horrible asthma, extremely sick. They thought he was going to, even after he graduated college, the doctor was like, you'd better not exercise anymore because you're going to die. And he's like, yeah, well, watch me, right? And so he always has that physical side, but then also the intellectual side, constantly reading, constantly bettering himself. And I think that is what makes him really fascinating, is he had both sides.
I think one of the quotes is, in this life, we get nothing save by effort, right? So he definitely pushed himself, and it was not passive, very active, aspiring to kind of succeed in these different things. And I think that is, something that anyone can apply, is not to coast in your life, to kind of push towards achievement, even if it's difficult, even if it's in a much smaller scale than Roosevelt. I think you can challenge yourself. I think anyone would say there's a huge difference in what a person will accomplish if they're just passively coasting and kind of accepting what comes in front of them versus proactively moving forward on something. So Roosevelt, he didn't make his own luck, but he was very proactive. He was definitely driving and pushing things. He was not waiting for something to be served up to him. And I think it's easy to do that.
One of the things I found interesting was the comparison between him and his brother. So they both had the same beginning, same parents, same wealth to start with, which was definitely an advantage, like going to Harvard and all that. Like that's a huge start in life. His brother had those same opportunities and it did not end well. And it actually ends up kind of becoming intertwined with Teddy's life because he had to deal with the fallout. But long story short, his brother becomes an alcoholic, a drug addict, ends up dying very young after pretty much devastating the family, and Theodore had to deal with that. But again, you had these two people who started with the same place, same parents, same values, but the main difference was discipline. I think Teddy was extremely self-disciplined. He was not necessarily a teetotaler, but he was, he turned down things like that his brother, I think the book commented, just couldn't say no to pleasure. And that was a major, you can just see the difference in outcome. It's like that could have been both of them, but it wasn't.
Yeah, in his, like, the strenuous life, one of the quotes is, he says, I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life. We don't talk like that anymore, but, ease. And as a kind of well-to-do background, there was probably a pull towards, I'm not saying that affluent families didn't aspire, but, you had more opportunity maybe to seek out ease, unlike the working class at the time. And so he was kind of holding up being strenuous, which what do you think of when you hear the word strenuous?
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean? And I think in the context of his life, it was never just sitting around and accepting the status quo. It's like any of the jobs he had, he could have just been that congressman, or he could have been president and been happy with that. But it was never, I think, we were talking about this outside of this, and it's like, for him, striving and achieving was not the destination. It wasn't about becoming president. It was about that was his life. That was just the way he lived.
Right.
And it's like these are all stepping stones. And so once he's done with the presidency, he's like, okay, I have always been into science. I'm going to go discover something in the Amazon, and like legit goes and does it. So
Yeah.
I think having that attitude where it's like, we're not just trying to check boxes. We're genuinely trying to achieve things.
Exactly. It's really, I think, a mindset is what you're getting at. Is that's inspiring. Is that it's not like my goal isn't to like become successful so that I can just sort of like sit back and ride the gravy train, and retire or whatever it might be, or like look for the easy way out. You're actually just saying like part of the operating, practice that I have of my life is that I'm like striving and like improve self improvement. Trying to make things better. You see that through civil service reform, not just accepting the existing
Right.
corruption, but pushing up against it. So there's obviously courage and boldness in those things.
So I think we can come back and cover the rest of his life in a future episode.
Yeah.
But I think maybe just reading imparting that quote that we started with, because now I think it totally makes sense in the context of his life here. So far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with the poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. And I think that sentence, those few sentences there, capture Theodore's life in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's a great note to end it on. So yeah, I enjoyed talking about this subject with you, Roosevelt. And the book is definitely worth reading. If anyone listening here hasn't, definitely go get the book and read it. But yeah, we've enjoyed this, and yeah, look forward to kind of bringing other subjects. Maybe we'll come back to Roosevelt in a future episode, but kind of covering more subjects like this in the future.
Awesome. So yeah, get out there, do some mighty
Do
things.
some mighty things. All right.
See ya.